And I'm very happy to have all of you here. And Roxy, thank you so much for joining us today. You can take it away. We are 44 people here in the audience that came to see you today. And how are you?
Amazing.
It
Thank
is.
you so much. Thank you so much, Yuval. And good morning and good afternoon and good evening, wherever you are. I love seeing that there's so many folks here from all over the world. I'm really excited to be here today and appreciate UX Writing Hub bringing me here and all of you for joining. And yeah, as you've all said, I mean, I've learned a few things scaling teams, and I've also had the good fortune of talking with a lot of people about their experiences scaling. So I'm excited to share some of those insights with you today. This is going to be a big overview, and I'm not going to go deep into any single one thing. The hope really is that everyone's going to find something that's going to be useful to them today in the talk. So there are challenges at every stage of a team's life. And today I'm going to cover 4 transition milestones. When you go from being a team of 1 to that really exciting time when you're bringing on an additional UX writer. Next, when you go from a smallish team of about 4, getting up to 5 or 6, then that transition into double digits. And finally, as you're heading into that big team zone of 20 or more. And while there are tons of things to keep in mind as you're scaling a content design team, today I'm going to focus on 3 areas. Craft, meaning quality and guidelines, the stuff that really keeps your standards and content design high. Operations, that's the stuff that helps your team function, the workflows, the systems, the practices and processes that keep things moving along. And then finally, people, because no matter how on point your craft and operations are, without hiring and supporting great content designers, your team is likely to fall apart. So before I arrived into tech, I worked for many, many years in publishing, scaling editorial teams. And in the world of tech, I've had a few different experiences scaling. When I joined Ancestry, I was the second UX writer they hired. At Dropbox, I was on a team of 4 when I started nearly 5 years ago and grew the team to 19. And later this month, I'm starting a brand new job at Cruise where I'll be pioneering the content design function. Today, I'm also going to share wisdom from other folks I talked to, content design leaders who are building teams from scratch, like Chris Beatty at Figma, or growing mid-sized teams like Mike Stempo at Uber, Chelsea Larson at Zendesk, and Jordan Craig at Twitter, as well as heads of some of the largest teams in our industry, Tina O'Shea of Intuit and Alicia Doherty-Wold of Facebook. But first, before we begin this journey together, I'd love us to take a moment to place ourselves. And, you know, right now, a place that sounds pretty nice to me is this island. And I can easily see myself on a hammock, you know, reading a book over there between those trees on the left. But this is no ordinary island. This is Content Design Island. Some of you may be familiar. It's a pretty nice place to weather the storms of reorgs. And while it's lovely and comforting, if you think about it, an island is really just another type of silo. But just as silos on farms exist for a purpose, so does Content Design Island. It's where a team can really go and ground itself. So as we go through these stages of growth, I'm also going to challenge us all to think about ways to keep the comfort of this lovely island in balance with the benefits of deeper connections to the mainland. So let's start with the most popular of growth moments, the one that I suspect the majority of people here today are going to relate to. What happens when you go from being a team of 1 to a team of 2 or more? So maybe you've been on your own for a while, you joined a startup, you've been writing everything from executive communications to landing pages to UI to emails, and finally, you've been granted headcount to get another person to join your team and shoulder the load. So where do you start? Laying a strong foundation is probably the most important thing that you can do when you scale a team to make sure it stays strong as it gets bigger. And it begins with craft. It's pretty easy to keep things consistent when you're the only one drafting content. But as soon as you bring someone else on, there's going to be a margin for variation. So start with the foundational building blocks of content, voice and tone. So what does newscaster Katie Couric have to do with that? For those of you who recognize who this is, well, at Ancestry, we used celebrities to help drive home who was speaking in our products. And for Ancestry, it was Katie Couric, not Walter Cronkite, not Connie Chung, but Katie Couric, someone who was friendly and approachable, and also knowledgeable and trustworthy. To be clear, she didn't come out of nowhere, right? Katie Couric was actually the result of market research and insights and stakeholder input and a whole bunch of stuff. But it was something that really informed all of our work as writers and designers. So knowing your product's voice is important, not just for the function of content design, but for anyone who's communicating about your product. At this early stage, you may also need to spend some time socializing and helping cross-functional partners understand the basics of what voice and tone are. We might all know what those things mean, but never assume that non-writers do. So break it down in real simple terms. A product or a company voice doesn't change. It's a constant, just as your human voice is. Your voice is tied to your identity as a company's voice is tied to its brand. But the tone changes depending on where you're speaking. It's the emotive lever you can pull. For example, you're likely going to use a different tone for an error message that you're going to use in a welcoming sequence. One of the reasons voice and tone matters is because they help distinguish your product from competitors. So it's also important to audit the marketplace. Spend some time just seeing what else is out there and mining any style guides that are public. Which products are doing a good job? Which are doing a poor job? How can you learn from what you see? And then spend some time capturing what those guidelines should be, but resist the urge to get granular. Not everyone loves to nerd out on the specifics of title case and sentence case and stuff like that, but I know a lot of UX writers that do. And digging into that stuff can really be very bonding for a team. And it can also breed investment from the team to champion and uphold those standards. So maybe your company is ahead of the game. Maybe the marketing and brand team already created the voice and tone for your product. Fantastic. But when it comes to in-product writing, we've all been there before, where the ratio is extreme and you've got one UX writer trying to keep up with the needs of a dozen or more product designers. How you're going to staff those needs is an important part of laying a foundation for your operations. Establishing a target product designer to content designer ratio with your manager is an important step. How many product designers should a content designer ideally be partnering with? Honestly, secretly, 1-to-1 would be my dream come true. But the reality is that 4-to-1 is what we aspire to at Dropbox. And I've heard your target when you start, but it's really important that you plant the seed of where you're hoping to go. And in order to come up with that ratio, you need to understand what your company priorities are. Go to the company all hands, discuss company strategy with your fellow content designers, or start a Slack thread about it. Knowing what's important to the organization is going to help you sketch out ideas for your team's strategy and set direction and prioritization, because you should assume that there's always going to be too few content designers to meet the needs of your company. That's just the reality. And getting clear on company priorities will help you figure out what to say no to in order to say yes to the right things. And finally, as a team of one, maybe you weren't running your content by anyone, or maybe you were sharing a design crit, but it's different when you're sharing with other writers. Suddenly you're in the same craft and share a similar expertise. So what are the new norms of your feedback process? Do you have weekly workshops? Do you comment asynchronously in a doc? Do you invite PMs and researchers and product designers into your feedback loops? Taking some time to consider these practices is going to prepare you for the day when it's not just you on the team. Chris Beatty and I worked for a long time together at Dropbox, and when he became the first UX writer at Figma, his priority was not establishing pillars of focus or creating standards. It was really about laying the foundation for a culture and building product knowledge. He says, the most important thing you can do in year one is build trust, build connection, and start to build a culture of writing. For him, it was about saying yes to everything. And so you might actually say no to a few things, but if you're going to do that, it's really important that you say no in a way that keeps the door open instead of putting up a wall. Chris also shared that once you start hiring others, it's not so much what you're doing on your own, but it's about helping your future teammates know what your design team and organization has to offer. It's a brand building moment, both inside your company and outside in the design community. First off, figure out who should that first hire be? What do you need? I'd recommend someone senior to begin with, someone who could be autonomous in their work. And in order to hire, you're going to need to figure out who's going to be on your interview panel. This matters. It's a good moment to get your elevator pitch right about the impact of content design with your cross-functional partners. And it's also a great time to ask your colleagues, what are they hoping to get out of this content designer? That's likely going to shape the questions that you're going to ask these candidates. But even before anyone comes through the door, what are they going to see when you post the job listing? What will that job listing say about your team and your company? Don't be afraid to let your personality shine through, or your company's personality. That's the first moment that you get to sell your team to others, to help them understand why it would be awesome to work with you and your company. Here's Chris's job posting for a UX writer at Figma. The lead-in tells you something about the place right away. Hi, writer, it's us, Figma. There are other conversational moments throughout the listing, but it still makes clear what the qualifications of the role are about without turning into a stale corporate missive. When I spoke to Michael Stempo at Uber, he also mentioned how important it is to establish a base of trust with those first hires. Make sure you can be honest with each other, because ultimately, these first few folks are going to be the founders of your team. The advantage of bringing on senior talent is also that you no longer have to make all the strategic decisions on your own. For Mike, he says, I carve out clear ownership for each report. For senior content designers, I ask them to identify where they can have impact and build around that. An experienced content designer can help you discern where to prioritize. At those initial stages, you really do need a partner, and someone who is senior is probably going to be pretty excited about that level of scope and investment. So at this first moment of scaling your team, laying a strong foundation is the focus. Establishing your voice and tone and high-level guidance, setting a target ratio for your team that'll inform your staffing approach, and using your first hire as a marketing moment, both inside your org and in the community. So you've done it. You're now a team of a few folks, and you're going to hire a few more. Content Design Island is expanding a bit. When this happened at Dropbox, Chris was leading the team, and I remember the four of us got together and we talked about how we were going to retain the small town feel that we had as the team got bigger. So our team norms have been pretty organic. We were autonomous, but we were still connected. But as a team grows, that connection needs to be made in a more intentional way. Aligning your approach is critical to the success of a larger team at this stage. So as you go from 1 to 2, you can keep the guidelines fairly high level, but once you have 4 or 5 content designers together, it's time to get into specifics. Think about the example from usability testing. You test just 5 users and it turns up roughly 85% of the problems in an interface. It's that range of opinions that matters. And those opinions can also help you land on whether it makes sense to punctuate notifications or not, for example. A desire for more specific component writing guidelines is what inspired me to launch the UX Copy Styles project at Dropbox 4 years ago. While we had general writing guidelines, there was nothing that drilled down on the specifics of what UX writers did day to day. Nowadays, you can gather a lot of these best practices by looking at new standards like Microcopy the Complete Guide by Kinneret Yefra or Writing is Designing by Michael Metz and Andy Welfie. But when I got to Dropbox, these didn't exist. So together, the 4 of us started auditing our product, discussing styles, and making decisions together. In the process, we also started to figure out what mattered to us as a team and for the betterment of the product. And we were also creating a resource for non-writers since we couldn't touch every piece of UI. We were detailing our standards, getting really into the nitty-gritty. And once you start standardizing component writing guidelines, it's a good idea to think about patterns, those common flows that we frequently encounter as content designers, and especially those flows where content design helps drive the success of the experience, like education or onboarding. Content-led UX benefits from alignment during earlier stages since they involve multiple stakeholders across an organization. And if your content designers can be at the forefront of establishing those patterns, that's also going to help you gain influence across the company. So the great thing about having these guidelines in place is also that they provide a reference point for your workshops. Once you emerge from having 2 content designers, you're probably going to need some sort of forum to discuss your work. At Dropbox, we had a robust workshop practice. And once the team got bigger, we also had guidelines for moderators to make sure we were staying on topic and being inclusive in the way that we were talking about stuff. And keep in mind that inclusive does not mean compliant or always in agreement. I actually think spicy conversation is where true discovery happens. Just as you're establishing trust at those early stages with your first couple of writers, it's really important to foster an environment where constructive criticism is welcome. So at Dropbox a few years ago, we adapted a framework that was being used in a design crit to help guide our workshop discussions. It details what kind of feedback the presenter is hoping for. Ideate, so that's to brainstorm together. Guide, to help decide between options. Refine, to improve. Align, to make sure things are consistent. Finalize. This one was especially important because I think something that I see often in workshops is you kind of go deep down the rabbit hole. And when you know that someone's really just looking to finalize something, it gives a clear signal that deep critique is no longer needed. And then finally, FYI, for more share out level stuff. So before the workshop, people sign up, they say how much time they need, when they're doing the handoff, and that's it. It's super basic and it's continued to be foundational to our practice. Aligning on a tool for workshopping can also be really helpful. For example, Chelsea Larson, who runs a team of 9 at Zendesk, says they use the whiteboard tool Miro to workshop. At Zendesk, they also have a producer who helps track projects in Jira and helps scale practices effectively for the team. Chelsea also works in partnership with product and design leaders to hone in on how best to support products. She says, we look at business priorities, possible levels of impact, and what is content critical, meaning the product language could make or break the user experience. Because at the end of the day, the UX content you're developing should serve the product and the people who are using the product. That's the goal. And chances are that that goal is probably going to line up with what your company is hoping to accomplish. At the earlier stage, I mentioned building awareness and understanding for company priorities. But once your team is up to 4 or 5, it's really important to more explicitly connect the work that your team is doing to what's happening up top. There are likely company goals to align with. And even if your company doesn't have a robust OKR process, it doesn't mean that your team can't pioneer the way. Many of you probably already know that OKR stands for objectives and key results. This is a way of helping a company meet its aspirations, developed by Andy Doerr and introduced to Google in the late 90s. At its core, it's simply a goal system. So whether or not you pick OKRs or some other method, the important thing is that you're tracking what you're doing, holding yourselves accountable, and then sharing your successes with the organization too. At this stage, you're probably also dealing with a bit of a hybrid consulting and embedded model. And if you're not, it's a really good time to clarify those. If you're embedded, you're deep in product thinking and collaborating with product designers at every stage of development. And if you're mostly consulting, working off briefs or more of a waterfall approach, it's different and it offers a lighter level of value. And your teammates should know that. One quick way to help people understand the difference is by launching office hours. But whether you embed or consult should be dictated by company priorities. Ask yourself, which projects will benefit most from deeper investment? In the same way as you approach alignment on writing guidelines for components, come together to pick which styles of documentation seem to work best for your copy recommendations. Settling on a few different templates can help your partners know what to expect and cultivate equity across design teams. I also want to mention that there may be times when folks want to jump right into the Figma file to draft and iterate. This is very common. I think it's coming up more and more. And in my experience, having some record of changes and rationale is helpful, both when you're trying to articulate your choices to others when something isn't working, or to learn from your successes so you can replicate that success. It also gives you a place to document the company priority that your UX content is in the service of. So personally, I'm a believer in copy docs, and I think they can also be really helpful to more junior content designers who are still developing their process and craft. And in fact, an opportunity to bring on junior talent is one of the benefits of this moment as you're scaling and developing ways for your team to grow. Having a number of senior content designers as part of your team means once you hit 5, it's a good time to onboard mid-level and more junior talent. Not only does this provide mentorship opportunities for your senior writers, but it's a great way to make sure your team has a future as those junior writers become senior contributors themselves. Level is an aspect of diversity. As you continue to expand your team, diversity becomes more critical. As a Cuban American who came into tech from a non-tech background myself, I'm personally very passionate about this, but diversity honestly is just good for business. Not only are diverse teams statistically more innovative, they also outperform their less diverse teams. And for Jordan Craig, who runs a team at Twitter, making sure she was hiring a well-rounded team was a priority so that the empathy required across nationality, gender, and diversity of thought was represented. Diversity can also speak to the expertise you start bringing on. For example, perhaps you have a quality superstar as well as an amazing systems thinker. Those don't necessarily have to be the same person, and diverse hiring helps you keep an eye on that range of skills. Finally, if you have different levels of folks on your team, you'll need to start getting clear on the expectations for each level and the pathways to promotion. If your organization hasn't already developed a leveling framework, it's good to put something basic together for content design. If your hope is to develop equity across functions, then consider aligning your content design framework to the one that product designers use. For example, in his talk on maximizing the impact of content design at Intercom, Jonathan Coleman shared the leveling framework they use, which fortunately for everyone is available online under the Creative Commons license. This is just a sample of one of the areas they track, product and teams. As you can see, the competencies of product knowledge, influencing vision and strategy, and working with cross-functional partners are expected across disciplines and across levels. So at this point of scaling, going from 4 to 5, it's really about aligning your approach, spending some time getting into the nitty-gritty of guidelines and forging some craft connection with your team in the process, getting more explicit about how you prioritize content design work that's going to benefit the business, and then sharing that out with stakeholders and leaders. And finally, making sure you're helping content designers see a path of growth, whether they're junior or senior. So you've done it. Double digits is around the corner. This can be a really, really, really exciting time for a team. At this point, you may be developing specialties within your team, and you have a range of junior and more senior content designers allocated across the organization. The islands are connected. The sandbars make it easy to get from one island to the other. And even though you may have some unique plant life, the same birds fly from one island to the next, so they actually don't feel all that different. So while earlier you were setting the stage for intentional alignment, at this size, you really need to provide structure to support these methods. I remember when we arrived at this point at Dropbox, we had a great mix of UX writers. We had small clusters of teams across Dropbox, but we were still able to hold a single workshop in one conference room. And it was at this point that we decided to bring on a design systems specialist. Dropbox had a small design systems team building the Dropbox interface guidelines. We had the UX copy style guide, but it was time for those things to get integrated. Kate McGeehee was our systems content designer at Dropbox, and she did an amazing job integrating our component guidelines last year. Tina O'Shea, who leads the team at Intuit, told me that when they got to be about 10 or so, that's when they added a content designer dedicated to their systems team too. In addition to running the style council and being the go-to for recurrent content like error messages, this person works alongside the product and design folks on the Intuit systems team. So at this point, several folks on the Dropbox team were also dabbling in code. UX writing pioneer John Saito and content design star Jenny Tam were the first to get in there. They got trained up working closely with their engineers, and then they inspired and helped onboard other writers into the practice. I mentioned this as a quality topic because it was a way for them to push copy updates that might otherwise have been lingering in a backlog. But even if writers who code isn't for you or your team, prioritizing bug bashes as a place where you can get to know your engineers and spot errors before they go into the wild is really helpful for maintaining quality and integrating with your other teams. So once you've got guidelines, it's also important to start establishing a way to govern them. Drafting guidelines in the first place is an accomplishment, but if there's no rhyme or reason to the way the rules are made or maintained, then the value can be questioned. The governance model can be a single point person who gets to update the guidelines, or it can be a small body of folks. Whatever your approach, make sure you're transparent about it. A tool can also help you socialize and integrate your styles. For example, Jordan Craig's team at Twitter went from 5 people to just shy of 20 in a year and a half. Her first priority in scaling was focusing on aligning terms and styles across products. And the avenue for doing that was to invest in a tool. She says, giving people access to a tool that was functional and efficient was key. So if they needed to write a sturdy first draft, they could do that. The tool they chose was Writer, and because it was a startup at the time, the Writer team was more than willing to customize the tool to fit the needs of Twitter. Here's a snapshot of the style guide in the tool. It functioned like Twitter's own version of Grammarly, but with the Twitter product writing style guidelines built in. And today, in addition to housing their style guide, the tool also manages terminology across Twitter products, as well as their copy strings. The custom dictionary tells you what terms are approved as you write, and strings management separates the content layer from the app layer so writers can edit, score, and publish strings. So for Twitter, Writer is a tool that manages their content, something that works to support both their content design craft and their operations. By framing your practices, you're adding structure and making your ways of working more consumable by your partners so that expectations are clear on both sides. So tools for content management become more important as the team grows. And when you're dealing with dynamic interface content, there really is no one-size-fits-all solution. At Dropbox over the years, we've explored many different tools, including Writer, Acrolinks, Ditto, and others. And this year, the team will be piloting Airtable as a lightweight content management solution. You have to customize your solution to meet your team's needs. But the important thing at this stage of scaling is really just to start exploring. So at this point, if you haven't yet started sending out a newsletter or other type of team update, it's a really good time to do it. This not only gives you a venue to share news about your team, like new hires, but you can share ways that your team has made an impact on the product. For example, did updating that copy on a button result in more click-throughs? Then make sure you share that out. It's also a really great way to share a UX writing tip or two, or point to a link to where people can find your guidelines. Over the years at Dropbox, our newsletter took many forms, but last year we got a bit more methodical about the content and the cadence. And the sooner you can do that, the quicker you'll socialize your team's good work across the company. So you're exploring tools, you've got your comms in place. Next order of business is to formalize your engagement. That is a lot of fancy words. And really what I mean by that is just detail how you're working with your teammates. So earlier I mentioned you might be doing some sort of consulting embedded model. How might you communicate that to your partners? Last year, we rolled out the high, low, no engagement model at Dropbox. I had an amazing leadership team with Angelique Little and Margie Levinson, and together we developed this framework as a way for the team to focus on high impact results while minimizing burnout. Here's how it works. So on a quarterly basis, we develop staffing plans. We first prioritize based on customer, business, and foundational goals. And then based on those priorities, we staff teams according to the high, low, no framework. So some content designers work in high engagement, meaning that they're fully embedded. And this level is particularly good for 0 to 1 bets or complex functionality or content-led experiences like onboarding. Some teams are staffed with low engagement or consulting level. For teams that have already had an embedded content designer, this can work, as a way to keep things maintained or even to optimize. And then finally, because of the size of our team, there are always going to be teams with no support. That means that those designers and PMs and everyone else on that team need to leverage self-serve writing resources. This does not mean that they get office hours. So knowing where you're not going to staff is just as important as knowing where you're allotting your resources, particularly at this stage. Because it's all about structure as you're going into double digits. Structure in the ways that you're working, as well as the ways that you're continuing to build your team. And at this point, it's also good to start offering pathways for senior ICs that might not be interested in managing. For example, at Dropbox about 2.5 years ago, I developed the content design lead role. John Saito was the first one. And the reason it made sense is that there were 3 UX writers working on Dropbox paper at that time. John was already providing craft leadership for the group, and formalizing this role gave him recognition for that work and also helped EPD leaders know to bring him in for strategy too. John oversaw craft, but as the manager, I continued to do the performance management with the team. Eventually, we had several IC leads, and last year, the managers and leads collectively revisited the role to align with current expectations. That calibration is really important. It helps everybody stay invested. And when she led the revamp, Intuit principal content designer Ashley Goodrich made a bunch of updates, including this helpful chart. So our leads played a really important role in scaling content design over the years at Dropbox. And at one point, we weren't big enough to have multiple managers, so leads helped us plug into senior level strategy, which was an opportunity also for them to work with other design leaders. I was the second manager on the Dropbox content design team, and soon there were 3 of us in addition to the head of the team. Each of us had a distinct area of responsibility with several reports. Ideally, these are managers that can partner across EPD leaders in those groups, depending on the structure of your company. The key is not necessarily that those people who are partnering are managers, but that there is some visibility at those levels for the function of content design. If at this size, your content designers are still operating in a reactive model of supporting several teams, it can be really tough to find time to make the case to grow. It's also exhausting and difficult to work like this. You know, a squeaky wheel may get the grease, but it's also not likely to help a bicycle do much more than roll along. So in order to really truly influence a design organization, a content design team needs to move beyond complaining and into strategic solutions mode, partnering with other EPD leaders. Because when you start making smart suggestions, leaders notice and understand the value of content design, and they start doing the advocacy for you. So at Intuit, the content design org, including contractors and international teams, is nearly 50 strong. Director of Content Design and Strategy at Intuit, Tina O'Shea, affirms that if you can get other people to advocate for you, it comes through and it's heard. So if your content design team has a big success that brings in revenue, chances are that's going to please the PM or the GM on that project. Before you know it, they're the ones who are asking for more content design headcount for their teams. So as you make that exciting move into double digits, remember to provide structure for your team. Get integrated with your guidelines and other quality measures as they cross into other functions. Frame your practices in clear, consumable ways so that your team and your partners know what to expect. And finally, consider the overall shape of your team and scaffold so that you're able to plug into leadership. Well, if you've made it to 20 in your company, then y'all are doing a lot of things right, especially since that shows that the company is investing in content design. And at this stage, the head of your team likely has a seat at the table along with other directors of the design organization, and there are plenty of opportunities. You have choices. It's not just an island or a few islands. You're now venturing into the realm of creating an ecosystem all your own. So spend time building a community of content design. Alicia Doherty-Wold, now a VP of design at Facebook, joined the company's content design team more than a decade ago when it was only 3 people. She shared that as a team grows, you start with a small group that has strong rapport and balanced strengths, and then tend to focus on replicating the small team growth dynamics that you encounter earlier as the team is getting bigger. Facebook's global content design team has an annual internal conference, cleverly named Comic-Con. It brings together the company's entire content design team to share inspiration, craft, best practices, and community. At Intuit, they also have an annual symposium, and last year's was attended by some 70 people. But you don't have to hold a large-scale event for something like this to be really valuable for your team. Even when you're smaller, getting together to talk about your team's aspirations, company strategy, and craft is really important. Last January at Dropbox, we held our first strategic onsite where we talked about the big and the small stuff with several people from the team presenting on a range of topics. The second one we held in July was done virtually with interactive Zoom sessions over 2 days and a breather of heads down time in the day in between. And we held our third one in February, and the plan is to continue to do that 2 times a year. In addition to helping us align on craft and strategy, these gatherings have also helped us bond as a team. A summit is also a great time to bring in speakers who can continue the education of your team. But you can do that any time of the year. And these can be really casual too. Over the years, we've had lots of friends of the Dropbox team come talk to us. Most recently, Chelsea Larson shared highlights from her talk about how to influence designers and engineers, which was a lot of fun. And just as you are inviting folks to come to you, make sure you're giving back and you're sharing your good work with other teams. Encourage your teammates to pitch conference talks and get out there in the community. It matters. Last year, Dropbox content designers blew my mind. They were very, very busy and spoke at a dozen or so events. When Dropbox staff content design lead Jenny Tan spoke at Button, we hosted a preview event including Sophie Taryn, John Pass, and Angela Gordon. Several of us also attended the conference to cheer Jenny on. That was also an opportunity for the Dropbox UX writing team to show up and have a presence at this community event. And this year, Jenny also encouraged her Dropbox teammates to apply to speak at Button, and many of us did. So that encouragement can be really catching. So how you're showing up in the community matters a lot, especially when you're part of a large company with a recognizable brand. The stakes also get higher for operations as a team scales up. Maybe you have a design ops person to help at this point, but if you don't, workflows become a bigger deal as a team gets large. So if you can streamline from the start, you're really ahead of the game. And once you're the size of Intuit or Facebook, the impact of inefficient workflows can be massive and very expensive. There are lots of opportunities when it comes to content workflows. Depending on your organization, you may already have a close collaboration with your marketing partners. But if you don't, there's no time like the present to start. Often marketers are the ones introducing a feature and describing its functionality. One way Chris Beatty helped us align UX writing and product marketing at Dropbox was by introducing talk about docs. These were not elaborate messaging frameworks, but short docs that included key benefits and terminology. And over the years, we've invited other functions like customer support to collaborate in these docs as well. Another team that greatly benefits from workflow alignment is localization. Often translators are relying on context notes that engineers quickly drop into the code. Sometimes those help, but sometimes they don't. So if you can add notes for localization folks in your copy docs, that can be helpful, or even better yet, explore ways to give them access to the design components in Figma or wherever the handoffs are happening. There are lots of options depending on how your organization is, the localization team operates and what tools they use. So really just starting with a conversation to get to know each other is the right first step. So hopefully if your team is at 20 plus, you're already making choices that keep the UX content accessible. One aspect of accessibility that content designers often plug into is alt text, that copy that a screen reader will pick up for visually impaired users. Last year at Dropbox, content designer Eric Alves introduced a new idea of surfacing alt text and other accessibility measures through a Figma and Airtable workflow. It's still in an early stage, but ideas like these can really help position your team's content in all the ways that ultimately show up in your product. So by the time you're at 20 plus, you're expanding, not establishing an understanding of the function. If your team is going to grow, it's really important that product leaders understand the value of content design. That's why advocacy and evangelizing are so critical at earlier stages as you're scaling up. VP of Design Alicia Doherty-Wold has seen Facebook content design team at every stage and mentioned that the team grew by building relationships with product partners. She says, growing from a small centralized function into a large one required earning trust and investment from product leaders. So when planning is done in partnership with product leaders, they can be an engaged part of the conversation about what functions and work they want to prioritize. For example, if you know you'll be building products with a lot of educational flows that are important to the understanding of the new experience, headcount might be better allotted to a content practitioner or two versus that additional engineer. Ideally, this planning happens in partnership so that the product leaders have a stake in the allocation. At this size too, you're looking for pretty senior managers who know how to coach and grow other managers. This is a skill in and of itself. Just as an earlier stage, you can bring on more junior IC talent when you have senior content designers to mentor them. You can enjoy a similar approach with your management team, so you're continually fostering new talent. And depending on the company and the org structure, there might even be an opportunity for content designers to manage other design disciplines. That's a model that's worked well at Shopify and many other companies where their managers are discipline agnostic and oversee the work of product design, research writing, and others. So if you're lucky enough to build a team beyond 20, remember to build your community. Raise the bar of your craft and quality, both by internal training and giving back to writers in the larger design community. Connect content workflows within your company and treating all the words in a holistic fashion. And finally, expand the understanding and scope of the content design function within your organization. So to recap this journey from 1 to 20 plus, at the beginning, lay a strong foundation because that's where everything else is going to grow from. When you get to that 5-ish moment, make sure you're fostering strong alignment across your team and your company. And then when you hit double digits, provide structure, make sure you're supporting all those methods that you've developed. And finally, once you're one of the big ones, make sure you're building that community. One more thing, as we went through these milestone moments, you may have noticed I didn't talk about culture in and of itself. And that's because I consider culture as something that runs across everything. It's embedded in your craft and your operations, but that doesn't mean that there aren't explicit ways to tend to the culture needs of your team too. When the Twitter team got to 15, Jordan Craig invested in a leadership coach to build empathy and awareness across our team, especially when a team is growing really rapidly and people are juggling tons of responsibilities. It's good to slow down and remember each other as human beings and connect beyond the work. Small culture notes like adding a photo in Slack on Monday of what you did over the weekend, those can also, do great things over time and really build that connection with your team. So what your team is going to do or need to do is going to be very specific to your group of content designers and to the culture of your company. But above all else, do what you can to foster open conversation and understanding. Because at the end of the day, we all exist in this larger community of connected content design islands, and there are boats and there are buildings and there are structures all over the place, a whole world that's a whole lot better when we know each other as people. So even though the function of content design now has been around for a while, even though it's been called a lot of different things, I still call it emergent because there's so much room for innovation. And I said this earlier on today, when you're talking about scaling a team, there is not a right way forward. There isn't one way to do it. Often it's just about finding a way forward that's supported by the company that you're in, by the products you're building, and the leader that you're hoping to be. So I hope that this talk has offered you some ideas to consider for your team and that you take them and you really make them your own. Thank you so much for being here.
All right, Roxy, thank you so much for this talk. I'm just writing here notes the whole time. I need you, this is a bug on Zoom, so I needed to make me a host so I could turn my video on. Then I'm going to share my screen with the Q&A poll. And so, all right, thank you for that. Okay, hello everyone, good to see you. And I'm going to share my screen right now. And there you go. Can you see my screen?
Yep.
Okay. So everyone, I just shared this link so you can vote on relevant questions. You can also ask your own questions as well. We'll try to cover as much as we can. And that's about it. And I also shared the relevant resources like different lists of style guides and also John Sato's article about should UX writers code. So check it, it's in the chat. And those are great resources that's related to this call. All right, so first question. How do you keep team morale up when you're prod? Designer to writer ratio is high and content work is undervalued.
That is so hard. And it's so very common. I do think like one moment at Dropbox that made a difference. I talked about the high, low, no operating model. And I think that has really empowered the Dropbox team to have this reference point to say, no, we're not going to work on these things because the only way to get to a ratio that's more humane is by saying no to certain things, right? And that is a really tough moment, especially when you're trying to establish the value for the function, but it allows you to really pick the things where that value is going to show up. So it's almost like there are two questions here. One is keeping team morale up, right? When that ratio is super high, and how do you show that value? Because if content design is undervalued, that means that there's some opportunity there to showcase the value of content design. So really communicating out what your wins are is really important. And to keep the team morale high, I mean, you can continue to foster some of these culture, like small culture bonding things, but you could do that to the wazoo, but if you're not fixing the ratio issue or the value issue, that's not going to end up like being a long-term solution. So really trying to find a way where you're able to say no to some of those things to make that ratio feel a little more reasonable, and then sharing out your successes so you get those key product leaders are becoming those advocates for you. I think that is the pathway.
All right, thank you for that. Okay, I'm just trying to. All right, sorry about that. Okay, so by the way, I have also a question. So I know that there are people here in the audience from different companies that haven't established a UX writing practice in their organization at all. And this is also many of the people that reach out to the UX writing hub. So a lot of time I need to educate in companies, non-writers, to actually do the writing, maybe front-end developers and designers, because the company don't have the resource they should have, but they don't put the resource to engage with and recruit UX writers. So how would you recommend, if you're like the first UX writer, or if you're a freelancer that work with a company or an agency of UX writers, how do you recommend to like educate companies about UX writing practices when they don't have any?
Yeah, I love that question. I mentioned that I had a great leadership team with Angelique Little and Margie Levinson. And something that Angelique has done an amazing job on is sort of vamping our onboarding deck. It's a bit of a roadshow of the value of content design. And here's what I would say: if you're like the one and only at an organization, think about what that presentation would include. What are those like critical ways that content design shows up and makes an impact on a company? And how can you put that into a bit of a presentation that you're able to share with key people in the organization? Maybe you can go to, a PM all hands and just like, hey, can I borrow 5 minutes? And I just want to talk to you a little bit about the content design function. I think those are the moments. Again, it's our job to educate, right? No matter if UX writing and content design has been here for 15, 20 years, I really always take it on like going to cruise. I know I'm going to have to do some education and evangelizing. It's always going to be a part of my job. So I know for me, that's something, my first order of business is probably going to be to create that deck, right? To create that little like thing that helps people understand the basics of what the function is and how it makes an impact on a product.
And now that they know, for example, I have a front-end developer that I work with, and it creates a lot of different screens, and it don't know how to write, and the copy that you write is not that great, but it needs some guidance about like even creating the prototype of the copy. So is there some kind of a resource that you usually share with non-writers?
Yeah, I mean, I mentioned the UX copy style guidelines, and I think this moment I think Dropbox is still kind of in it. So we have the design interface guidelines, and then we have the UX copy style guidelines, and those are getting more integrated sort of in a single resource. I think if you can point engineers or any other function to those resources, that can be really, really helpful. Or even if you could set up like a quick 15-minute like working session with them to give them some really high level, like, hey, here are 3 tips. Just next time that you're drafting something, keep this in mind. I think keep things very, very basic to really get things to at least that minimum bar of quality that you're hoping to get to.
All right, thank you so much. And that was really helpful. Okay, so next questions. How would you describe the ideal content design process? Now, this is a complicated one because you mentioned in the beginning that, you have many islands, and also in the end, there is many islands, many processes, many companies. But so that's a complicated one. But do you want to take it?
It is complicated. I mean, I'll say 2 quick things. Like dream come true for me, like I can tell you what's personally ideal is like when there are no disciplines, there's no titles, right? That's when you start designing, is when you're in a room and you're all just designers thinking about the problem. And I think when you can take off those mantles of you're a content designer, you're a researcher, you're a product designer, get into the work, come up with solutions, and then you can like put on those specialty hats and really drill down into your expertise. That to me is an ideal sort of way of beginning work. That is deep engagement, right? That is a fully embedded experience. I did mention, you can be low engagement, you can be in a consulting model. I do think that's probably more often what you see in companies, because if you have 1 or 2 UX writers or content designers, they're like, oh, let's maximize, the breadth here versus the depth. So I think there's some things that you can manage that way, but ideally with really like complex features or new products, your content designers are really in there and they're being considered just designers, period.
All right, thank you. Let me just check that one. All right. Perfect. So we have 5 more minutes and we'll take a few more questions. So another one by Anonymous. Any recommendation for how to set up UX Writer 2 for success when they'll have to work pretty autonomously?
Yeah, wow, that's a good one. And I think it depends on who that number two is, right? Because it starts with hiring. It starts with hiring and making sure you know, I don't know, it depends on if you're the one doing that hiring, who that is. If they're a really senior content designer, you hope that they're going to be excited about that autonomy, and the way that you connect and that you're able to align can be fairly lightweight at that point. But I think if you're aligned up with your mission and vision of what you're hoping to accomplish, either at the company level or at the team level, I think that's going to go a long way to connecting you. One thing that Chris Beatty did when I started at Dropbox, which I'll mention, is I was the first writer on paper. There had been another writer before me, but he basically came into the paper all hands, and together we did a presentation about UX writing to that whole paper group. And I thought that was a really great way to introduce not only me as a new person to the organization, but the function itself. So I think if you're hoping to help shepherd this writer number two into the organization, if you can do something to that end to help basically evangelize for them a little bit, either before they arrive or once they're with you, I think that can also go a long way.
All right. Thank you for that. 3 more questions. I'm the first UX writer at a company that's doubled in size in a year. What should I have achieved by end of year 1 ahead of hiring another writer?
Ooh, that is, I hope that you've maintained your sanity and that you've taken a little time for yourself. Self-preservation is really important when you're the only one in a fast growth organization. This is a hard question because it just depends on what your product is and what sort of things you've already established. So some of the things that I mentioned, just having those conversations across the organization is really important so that you're doing that evangelizing, that socializing of the function before that next writer comes on. And I think potentially you starting to think about the places where you can make the most impact, if you are in tune with what the company is trying to do, that's going to help you sort of pick where that second writer will focus their work, right? So if there's like, a certain area of the organization that's all about onboarding and education, I mentioned that quite a bit as a content-led area. And I think like maybe that's where you want the second writer to go. I think you're going to have to get somewhat clear on where they might go. But if they're a senior person, then hopefully they can come in and help you identify that as well.
All right, thank you. Okay, when your Dropbox team grew from 4 to 5, how did you make time for governance, auditing, detailing guidelines while supporting product teams with new features?
It was hard. I have to say, I mentioned like not everybody likes to nerd out on like little nitty gritty stuff, but I do like that. Not everybody's into the systems and that stuff, but I love it. And so I think you really do need a champion within an organization. I think for me, like I was really excited to drive the UX copy styles project forward, and I would set up meetings and I would gather everybody. And in the beginning of that particular thing, we didn't really know what we were doing, right? We just kind of all got in a room. We started auditing. I think I called them like hunting sessions or something. We would basically just poke around the product, trying to audit and find stuff. And we just picked different areas to focus on. Like somebody took error messages, I took tooltips, somebody else took buttons. And it kind of became this fun, like just throwing stuff together. And we accomplished quite a bit in those first sessions over a month. So if you can sort of combine this process of doing these things with a little bit of fun, a little bit of team bonding, I think that can be really helpful.
All right. And last question, and I love this question. How do you recommend the team find speaking opportunities? Is that job of the manager? Is that the job of the manager? And before you answer, I have to say that the content strategy of the UX writing team of Dropbox is something that is, as always, was mind blowing to me because, for example, when I like John Sater when all and Andrea when she wrote so many articles about CopyDoc, so it made so much impact on the industry, like all of the engagement that your team had as content creators, if it's like speaking opportunities or even if it was like articles, that when we published in our community that there is like a UX writing position at Dropbox in Israel, for example, I got so many candidates, like fantastic candidates that wanted to work in your team. And I think that all of those engagement as content creators, as UX writers, is a fantastic content strategy if you want to hire talents and work with the most talented people in the world. And I love the fact that you did it at Dropbox, and this is just a sign out for me.
Yeah, I mean, thank you for saying that. And I couldn't agree more. John and Andrea, like they published so many things that really got us out there in the community. And I think that community part of it is the really important part, right? That you are giving back to the community and being visible as a team, because as a team, you learn a lot and you want to be able to share those learnings out with the world. To this question, like, how do you recommend a team finding speaking opportunities? Is it the job of the manager? I actually think as a leader of a team, I think it's helpful if you can be visible in some fashion, right? Because you're the representative of your team. And so if you can get out there and either write or speak or, talk about it, that's helpful. But I actually think like if you're excited to get that out there and speak, like nowadays, again, 4 years ago, 5 years ago, there weren't that many conferences. Holy smokes, 2 years ago, things blew up. And last year, there were so many conferences in spite of the craziness of the world.
Mhm.
And so it's a great time to stay focused on what those opportunities are. And I would just encourage everybody, if you're an IC, talk to your manager, say, hey, this is something I really want to do. Hey, can you, I'd love to present about this. Do you mind coaching me a little bit? Or if your company has resources, maybe there's some training that you can take about speaking. There's a lot of opportunity out there. And I think it's up to each person to really drive their career and move towards the things that they're really excited to do.
And also, it's a lot of fun, to be visible, to meet and network with people. Since those, events are so new, it's very exciting. I don't know, to meet people. Another thing that also changed in the last 2 years is that you see so many other tools, like you mentioned, like Writer and Ditto and Frontitude, which I really like. They're also from Israel, and it's so amazing to see how like we're growing as a community next to each other, and this is very exciting. Okay. Okay. Oh, sorry. So that's about it. Thank you so much, Roxy, for a fantastic presentation. I learned a lot from it. Thank you for being here today. That was so useful.
Thank you so much, Yuval. And thank you for what you've done to put UX writing, on the map and in the community. I think we talked about this before this talk started, but the UX Writing Hub has come such a long way as well. So I really appreciate you and appreciate what you're doing. So thank you.
Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for joining us today. I'd love for a feedback. So I'm going to leave here a feedback form. We like to, you know, if you have some kind of topic you would like us to cover in the future, some kind of a speaker, let us know. We would love to have your feedback. It will be very useful for us to improve our content as well. Um, and that's about it. In addition, feel free to join our membership if you want free access for 1 year to all of our events. 1 second, let me share the link right here. Oh, sorry, I can't find it right now. I'm going to send you the link to the membership if you're interested to join. I will send it via email with a recording of this presentation. In the meantime, feel free to leave us the feedback. And that's about it. I'll see you on our next event. And Roxana, good luck at Cruise. I'm
Thank you.
a big fan of your work, and I'm looking forward to what you're going to do at Cruise as well.
Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
All right. Thank you, everyone. Ciao. And I'll see you on the
Bye.
next event. Bye. Let me see if I can grab that link. Okay. Found it. So that's about it. That's the link to join us as members if you're interested in that. And thank you, everyone. See you.